Greetings, everyone. This is Tim Selden, President of the Montessori Foundation, and with me today are my good friends, Dr. Cindy Acker, Christine Lowry, and Tanya Riskin. What an interesting group of people have joined me. I've got a lawyer in Tanya. I've got a professional educator in both, well, all four of us. I've got someone, people who run schools, people who work with schools, people who used to run schools and are recovering from it. And today's topic is wide-ranging. Cindy, you published in your 2016 dissertation at the University of California at Berkeley a research about misperceptions and miscommunication between Montessori educators and the mainstream of education. I know that'll be one of the topics you want to explore today. There's also another issue. Congratulations. I understand Public Broadcasting System, PBS, is going to be coming to your school next week.
Yes.
And
no,
filming.
tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Yes.
And this is for the news hour, and they're going to be doing a piece on how at least one school teaches social justice to children as young as 3 or 4.
Exactly. Yes, they were searching around the nation for a model of a school that was committed to social justice and began that in their curriculum so as to effect change so that we reduce situations like what happened in Charlottesville.
Exactly. Well, where do we begin, my friends? What would you like to talk about? Cindy, tell us about what you learned in your research. I think that's always a good way to start, and I know that Tanya, you were involved with it. Christine, you wrote an article for the last issue of Montessori Leadership about Cindy's research. So where do we begin?
Well, why don't I give you a little bit of background about where I got to in getting there. First of all, I have to tell you that I am historically, my family is a member of the Mende tribe from Africa, and they are the group of people who were the very first ones to ever bring the issue of slavery to court. And so I think social justice has been in my bones for a long, long time. And because I have always had a passion for children, my interest has always been in social justice and equity as it relates to education. And when I was president of the National Child Care Association, I used to visit a lot of different preschools around the nation, but it was interesting that Montessori schools seemed to be having continual difficulty when it came to public policy issues, anything that had to do with teacher recognition, credentials, some of the other licensing regulations across the state. And then I started to notice that there was a disparity between teacher grant possibilities that teachers in the public sector could receive, or teachers who were not Montessori teachers could achieve and receive, but Montessori teachers weren't able to. And I kept asking the why, and eventually I started to do some research around just ideologies, where people's perceptions of other individuals, particularly marginalized or underrepresented populations, comes from. And I realized that people who are in positions of power, who are decision makers, when they use their own deep-seated ideologies in decision making, it can affect other people. And so from there I thought, well, I wonder how the difference between how people perceive Montessori education and how Montessorians perceive public education makes a difference in the decisions we make and how we view each other and how we carry out this field that is supposed to be common for all of us. And so IMC wonderfully allowed me to be a part of a piece of a conference, and so we did a conference in Sarasota, and there I was able to do two things. I did a workshop that was just fleshing out views that Montessorians had about the public sector. And then in California, I did a similar kind of fleshing out about how the public sector views Montessorians. And from that, I took the information that I knew could be validated by evidence and took 3 different categories of things that I knew that I could prove clearly, but were very far-reaching misperceptions and long-held misperceptions on either side, and then brought them to conference, to a workshop that was attended by Montessorians and some people from public schools and some public school Montessorians. So that was kind
Cindy,
of the
thank you.
beginning.
Hold on just a second. I just heard from Ann Messenger that they can't hear. So I'd like to just do a little reality check with the rest of our audience. Would you just go to the question box and let us know if you're seeing and hearing us okay? I'm going to type something quickly to Ann. And check your GoToMeeting reference settings. So we're just, okay, Celeste says I can see and hear you fine, and Steve says I can hear you fine. I have a hunch, based on that little sample of 2, that it may just be Ann who has to adjust her settings, just as Cindy, your colleague Karen, who signed on before you arrived, had to go through a whole hoops to get you logged in. Meanwhile, we are recording this, and we'll carry on. And thanks to everyone. Let's see. Nancy said that in her case she can hear, but I had to re-enter the webinar. Can you see us? Are you logged in, Nancy, or are you just listening to this on your phone? Anyway, carrying on. I think one of the things we should acknowledge is there is an organization, an informal network, called Montessorians for Social Justice. And Cindy, I imagine you have a connection with them?
I have just learned about them recently, actually.
They're a group of people who, like-minded souls who believe that Montessori needs to be more involved with proactive advocacy for civil rights and human dignity. And I want to remind all of us that Montessori is different things to different people. But if we want to go back to the roots of what she taught us, her argument was that this was the discovery of the child, the discovery of a secret of childhood, and that the human potential was much greater. And another way of saying that, or a different way of saying it, remembering the time and the place, is little girls are as capable as little boys. The children of poverty are as capable of children of great wealth. Children who are of color are as capable of children who are of European extraction. And we are all one. And she also taught us that humans evolve in their own unique way, and a wise school would be designed for differences, to allow each different way of being human that is positive. We don't tolerate cruelty and harm to other people. We definitely are there not so much to teach as to draw forth, to educate, educare, the root of what education means. We celebrate the uniqueness of every human being. And when you talk about social justice and miscommunication, they connect to each other.
Tim, I would just like to add to that the importance of education, and particularly Montessori education, being responsive to cultural diversity as well. And we're not just talking about people in poverty or people of color, we're also talking about people who have deep historic roots in a particular culture, and the respect that we need to have and that we need to foster for those cultures.
Absolutely. I remember about 5 years into the 25-year history of the Montessori Foundation, we received a letter in the mail from a Montessori teacher trainer who literally said, "So Tim, are you still into that piece, fill in the blank?" And could not understand why we, as a non-public school or as an organization that in this person's mind was predominantly oriented to supporting independent Montessori education, why would we care about peace? Why would we care about social justice? Why would we care about anything other than the American Montessori community, which is one reason why we founded the International Montessori Council. Today, I think all of the organizations see themselves as global, but 20 years ago they didn't. And the Comité Montessori Hispanico, for example, really had to work hard to get anyone's attention at the national level. Today, I think there's much more understanding of what you're saying, Christine, that we're living in a diverse world, and our purpose in Montessori is not just to teach children to read and write, it's how to live together in peace and to resolve conflict without violence. So back to social justice, Cindy, you have been selected as an exemplary school that teaches social justice at every age. How do you teach social justice to very young children in Montessori?
Well, it's an inclusive in-school model, so it's not just teaching to children, it's also teaching to their families. And so I know that one of the people that they're going to be interviewing is someone who created the expression anti-bias curriculum. And before that expression was even coined and I started the school, I wanted to find a model that allowed for everyone to be safe, for everyone to be honored. I know there's also the expression educational tolerance, and I thought, no, it needs to go beyond tolerance. And so we've done a lot of things administratively in our paperwork. We have never used the terms mother, father. We are very clear in identifying children and not making an assumption about their gender. We spend a lot of time, we create a name pronunciation sheet, and we go through it with the staff so that we make sure that we are pronouncing names appropriately, especially when we hear like Asian parents who say, "This is my name, but you can call me Bob." And I always ask, what is the name that you use? What is the name that you identify with? Because that's the name that we need to honor. That's the name that we need to choose. We have never made, well, actually, the first year we made an attempt at bringing in information about all holidays, only to discover that we did a total disservice because we were giving our impression of what the holiday was. And so we don't celebrate holidays as a dominant culture institution. What we do is to allow children and their families, if they want to come and share something about what it is that they do, why they do it, and how they do it, then they do. And apart from that, we celebrate the seasons, we celebrate things that have to do with the community and the continents and things like that. We're very careful about recognizing personal choice. And so there's never a set curriculum as though it should be a particular way, because the one thing that we've discovered is that as society is evolving, as children are changing, as the world is becoming browner and more multilingual, so are customs and personal preferences all changing. And that culture is a constantly evolving kind of situation, and we just need to keep riding along with it. And so the one moment in which we think we may have it, we never do. We had a couple of years ago a family who didn't believe in eating food that was cold or hot. They always ate everything as it is in its natural state. And so the we learned it because the child walked in with the lunchbox. We put the lunchbox, opened the refrigerator door for the child to put the lunchbox in the refrigerator, and the parent said, "Oh, we don't do that." And I needed to back up because my initial thought was, oh no, things need to be refrigerated. And no, that's my perception. and so in our school, we are forever looking at that, stepping back and observing not just what we see on the outside, but what you don't exactly see, just the expression of what may be coming out of the child or their family, and then asking the question and attempting to embrace that information and finding out the why, and then helping the children to appreciate that. So it's an ever evolving, every day, every moment kind of situation. You never have it in the bag. And I think that that's the piece where we mess up as individuals. Either we have a dominant culture mentality that says it should be like this, and I think that's even where public school and Montessori has had their challenge. But on the intra-school level, I think it's also a piece that gets us into trouble because we make an assumption about the way something should be, and we don't recognize the fact that nothing has to be any particular way.
Cindy, I would be really interested, particularly in the context of what you were just talking about, of what you discovered when you were doing the work with these various groups and looking at their perceptions, in particular, what you learned about perceptions, about biases, about prejudice, and some of the ways that you tried to examine that and to help those groups look at their perceptions from all three of the groups, the Montessori public folks, Montessori people, and the public schools, because I know, or my impression of what you were trying to do was to look at where's the disconnect and what can we do to help bridge that. Could you talk about that?
We haven't talked much about this disconnect, which is, what does that look like? And by the way, Michael Dorr, welcome.
Hi, I'm sorry, so very sorry I'm late. Something happened, but at least I'm here.
We're thrilled to have you, Michael. I'm glad that you're able to join us again this week. Everyone has been raving about the work that you've done over the last few weeks on curriculum. We have to turn that into a course. So, again, everyone here has a background of working in advocacy and a background of connectedness to the public sectors. We've all been either public school educators or consultants with public schools, or done teacher education with public schools, or sent children to public schools. And we also, as Montessori educators, have certainly been aware of the sense of awkwardness between the local public school teachers and the district as a whole, and the National Education Association and the teachers' unions and so forth, versus Montessori. And so let's talk a little bit about what your research showed, Cindy, in terms of what is the perception of Montessori from a public angle?
Well, what I discovered, just to give a little bit of intro into that, what I discovered is that the one thing that is common between Montessorians and public school leaders is that we form mental models. We have our own deep-set ideologies, deep-seated ideologies that come from how we've been raised, the environment around us, things that have occurred, things that other people and their mental models have imposed on us because they've shared us and we've taken them in. And from that, we develop our own perceptions about how things should be. And then connected to that is a piece that's very personal to each of us that has to do with our own ego and our own self-image, that once we take our ideology and how we are as individuals and we put that in the framework of being an educator, once someone has something that is different that they present and that it looks like it's successful, it shakes us up. because we then say, wait a minute, that means that what I've been doing all along is incorrect. What I have known from my life growing up and why I became a part of this profession and what I have been doing and how I have been molding and shaping children must be wrong. And so in order to protect ourselves, we then say, no, you are wrong. And there's only a right and a wrong, and I need to protect myself, and so it's got to be you. And so, and that existed on both sides and was probably the most difficult part of the work that I was doing, because Montessorians were saying, you need to make Montessori come out on top, and you may not say anything wrong about Montessori education. And what I really felt was this was eye-opening for everybody. And if we were charged by Dr. Montessori to do the spiritual work of the educator, then we need to look at ourselves and to say, what is it that we need to do differently? And so when I looked at the areas in which people in the public sector gave their input about Montessorians, there were 3 areas that it tended to fall within, and one of them was authenticity. And so there was an overwhelming number of people who didn't believe that Montessori teachers were truly teachers who had gone through any kind of robust education, and that therefore the philosophy itself wasn't legitimate because it was comprised of educators who didn't really have the full depth and breadth of education that they were tending to impart to children. There were people who, because of that, then felt that the coursework was inadequate, that it wasn't broad enough to encompass the things that we are seeing now. And it's very common in typical public school education courses that you hear new phrases, new bits of information based on research. And when people look back at Montessori, it was the same thing as it had originated without change. And so surely Montessorians were ill-equipped to be able to handle the changing landscape of education and society. And then there was also accountability, that they felt very strongly that there was no one with their hand on the table trying to make sure that everything was correct. And that within that there was a great possibility of schools that were providing inadequate instruction, that were not preparing children well to move on either into another school system or preparing them well as 21st century learners, preparing them well to be able to go out into the workforce, and that was a disservice to children, and that there wasn't accountability at any level. That perhaps the school principal might be someone who was looking at things maybe not, that there surely wasn't anything at a state level or a federal level that required anything of Montessori schools and made them accountable in the way that the public school system did. So that was the primary concerns that they had.
So what about the perceptions on the other side? Montessorians tend to really discount the legitimacy of mainstream public school is one scenario. The other is, well, that's the mainstream and all of our kids are going to go there, so we have to prepare our kids to go into a system that quite often in our minds is even more traditional than most contemporary public schools may be. So what do you find about misunderstandings?
What I found is that it was the same 3 areas. Because Montessorians felt that public school was not authentic because it taught to the test, and so children were getting an inadequate education. They really were not learning. They weren't becoming critical thinkers because they were only learning rote information. They felt that even though there was accreditation that was there, that the accreditation really didn't involve the rigor of the practicum that's involved in a Montessori environment where teachers are concretely working on materials and preparing their presentations and really coming to know the information deeply from within and learning how to question and to be able to help children through the process, as opposed to just learning question answer and how to teach the children the exact same type of question answer rote information. And they also felt that although there was accountability in systems, that there was no accountability for the teacher in conjunction with the child and looking at where the child needed to be, because all of the accountable measures were really just predicated on what was in the book and what was in the standards, but not what that child needed individually, and there was no accountability to that, no accountability for the heart and spirit and depth of the child. So it was the same three areas, just completely different perceptions.
So, Cindy, you've raised this, and I know these are topics that all of us, and I can hear Christine ready to jump in on this because she works so much in advocacy, but the question ought to be asked, so why does it matter? Why do we need to even bother talking to those public school people?
We need to bother talking because we are in the same field, and things are changing faster than we can even imagine, even as we speak. And it doesn't serve the child for either of us to be on, I was going to say on either side, to be on either side, because in order to be able to ultimately shape anything for the advance of children and of educators, we've got to be able to work together. It's the way that public policy moves, is in partnership. You can't do without it. You can't do without the support of other people to be able to move something through. And ultimately, we become losers. We become losers as Montessorians when we don't have a voice, but everybody becomes a loser when we don't end up moving something through as it needs to, simply because we've stayed in our own camp.
Wow, great. Christine?
I think one of the, that you've alluded to, one of the starting points.
Can you move closer to your mic? It's not very clear.
Okay. I think, I absolutely agree with you, Cindy, and a starting point that you mentioned is, of course, looking at our perceptions and looking at our biases and our prejudices, but looking at what are our commonalities. I hear so many Montessori people say either things like, oh, well, they're just out to get us, meaning state agencies or mainstream education, or well, there's nothing I can do about it, and so I just have to, particularly most range in the public sector I hear this from, there's nothing that I can do about the rules and the regulations that we have to comply with, so I just have to adapt to that. But I really believe that if we could look at our commonalities, we really, truly all do want what's best for children. How we provide what's best for children might look different depending on your philosophical stance. But if we start with that and then move forward to be able to speak in a common language, when we use Montessori ease, it's a way of identifying ourselves as a separate group. And it's, I think, a way of concretizing this idea of us versus them. That you discovered with your work and that you very much attempted to deal with. So I would actually like to hear again, and I mean, I've read your dissertation more than once and thoroughly enjoyed it, but I'm wondering if for some of the people who are listening to us, if it would be useful and beneficial for them to hear some of the techniques that you used to try to bridge that us versus them gap that is on both sides, as you've said.
I did a few things. One of them is that because I looked at mental models, and if you look at that diagram that's down there, it's some research that was done by Argyris and Scone about how people change perceptions, and that it really takes a long-term process in order for that to be able to happen. And so I wanted to measure in my research whether or not it was possible using various techniques to shift perceptions at all. I knew that I wasn't going to walk away with people saying, oh, I now love Montessori and I understand everything about it. I love public school and I understand everything about it. But I wanted to just open up the mind. I wanted to know, could there be any kind of shift? And so one thing that we looked at was what it takes in order to shift a mental model, and it involves a lot. It involves being able to take in information, to supplant that information, to be able to spend some time and get some real-world examples. And so I wanted to bring people to the table rather than just giving them something to read. I wanted them to see each other, to hear each other's lived experience, and that was something that was tangible in the workshop that Tanya was at, that people really shared and listened and were able to get a good sense of each other. And then I use embodied learning for the very last of the segments, so that I had public school adults come in and experience what it was like to work with Montessori materials, and then showed them the common core information so that they could see how we get to where we get to it. And they were quite impressed with that, because they never understood that learning was occurring using all of the things that we do. I mean, they certainly could make the connection between some of the math materials and things that are out there that are now used in public school education as well. But how the Montessori scope and sequence works, and the process of using the materials and the extensions, and how you get somewhere, and to have them do it themselves, it just opened up a world. It was quite amazing. And then I looked at metaphors and some of the things that Montessorians might say that shut down people in public school, and some of the things that people in public school say that completely shut down Montessorians, and attempted to change the language and use other words, or I would listen to it and then I would recapture it in a different way and say it differently so that they could hear it differently, and explain concepts without Montessori terminology and without public school terminology. So it sounded very simple, and it wasn't an attempt to simplify it as it was to exchange it and to make it something that was the same language for everybody. And that, I think, was a piece that was really pivotal.
Going back to your earlier point, Cindy, if I can put something in there, that idea of bringing the people in to see those materials and to really understand that there might be actual learning taking place leads to a concept that I was wondering about, which is dispelling misconceptions in general. If changing a mental model might be aided by undoing misperceptions or misconceptions about that other person's point of view. And both of us, Montessorians on the one side, or if there are sides, but Montessorians and everyone certainly have these misperceptions about what's going on that may color their entire belief. Let me give you a quick example, and I'll let you respond. Several years ago, I was in the Cincinnati airport with Denny Shapiro, of memory now only, but Denny and I were there, and we were talking to a very nice lady who is a superintendent of schools from another district who had also been in Cincinnati for a conference, but not the same conference which we had attended. And we asked her how it went, and she said, you know, everything was so wonderful. It was so wonderful. We could work with every single group. Well, except there's one group nobody can work with. Montessori teachers. Have you ever heard of them? They are so hard to work with. They are so stuck in their ways. They're impossible. Of course, Danny and I looked at each other, and what happened then I won't go into, but that deals with misperceptions. And I've never forgotten that particular thing, and I'm wondering if that mental model that she displayed, as well as the ones that of course are in my own sort of construct, if those misperceptions being straightened out can help rearrange that mental model, which you kind of question, is change even possible? Anyway, that was where I wanted to go, Cindy.
Yes. Well, I walked away thinking that change is I started hoping that change was possible. I ended feeling very confident that change is possible. And I think that, you know, that mental model, when you walk into a room and there's a Montessori person who is there, that they are probably going to be stiff and unmoving. And some of us live that out so that that mental model is continually exercised in the minds of people. But I think the more that that we change it, and one of the things that is inherent within changing a mental model is that you have to be able to, I think you referenced that, you have to be able to undo the view that you had before and then supplant it with something that is new and that you want to use to shift your mental model. But in order for that to occur, that experience has to be there over and over and over. It's like the difference between what happens when you go to a workshop or to a Montessori conference and you go, wasn't that great? And then you walk away, you go back into real life and you return to the same things that you were before, and somewhere in there, you know, that workshop was good, can't remember what it was that got said, and you have the exact same practice as a teacher or administrator that you had before. But if we continue to experience something that changes the model, that changes the perception so that the model is different, that's when the mental model starts to adjust. In my back to school speech to my parents, and we have an incredibly diverse community, I said, look around. In order for you to change the social situation in the world today, you have got to widen out your community and associate with people who are dissimilar to yourself. And so for mental models like that to be changed between the public sector and between Montessorians, we've got to connect, we've got to exchange. It's like, how often are we out there inviting people from the public sector to come to a Montessori conference because we want them to be able to experience things with us, or to have a workshop that is an exchange with public school leaders and Montessorians, or public school teachers and Montessorians, or to have, we have wonderful things where we share materials. What about inviting public school teachers to experience some of the things that we create, that teachers create, and seeing some things and having a discussion over why it is that we do what we do. Those are the kinds of things that start to open us up and allow us to be less viewed as people who are rigid and unmoving and unwilling to engage in partnership.
I think we have to remember that it's really not binary, public and Montessori or traditional and Montessori. It really starts off with private and public, or public, charter, and private. Because let's face it, most public school educators are not all that comfortable with charter schools, no matter how traditional they are, because they draw off students and they draw off money from the local schools. So the whole issue of why would anyone choose something other than to go to their local neighborhood school? There could be all sorts of internal divisions within a public school between teachers of an IB program, for example, in a school that shares its building with a non-IB program, or a talented and gifted wing within a large public elementary or middle or high school. You get all kinds of things, but it really starts with public and private. There's another division we just need to be aware of, and that's the division between early childhood educators and people who are educating school-age children, otherwise known as kindergarten and above in most of the world. And People who are high school educators, generally speaking, do not understand why anyone would want to work with 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds, or they don't give them a lot of respect. And they don't give a lot of respect to even public elementary educators or middle school educators. There are all kinds of hierarchies. So misunderstandings are even wider than Montessorians are rigid and public schools are doing bad things to children. It can be as simple as, why does anyone waste their money on going to a non-government funded school? And that's a whole conversation in its own right. I don't want to get into that today, except to acknowledge that today the majority of Montessori schools are still independent. There is a growing number of public and charter schools, but most of us work with independent or private, non-public Montessori schools. And I think it would be worth remembering that that world is divided up into pieces too. There's the Snate academies on the hill, where only the movers and shakers of the community get to come, or the schools that are private and very expensive that also pride themselves in only taking in the best and the brightest, sort of the Ivy League preparatory schools. And then there's the faith-based schools, Jewish, Catholic, Episcopalian, you name it. And then there's schools for troubled kids of all sorts, some wonderful schools, military academies that, you know, you send a child to who needs hyperstructure, or the Catholic school where people proceed, you send them because they need more structure. Or there's finally a group of schools where what they sell to the consuming public is a different way of life, a different philosophy, a different approach. That's where Montessori fits into the non-public sector. It also, of course, is the way it fits into the public and the charter, which is a publicly funded sector as well. Montessori schools are schools of choice, and all of us tend to be much more diverse, egalitarian, and down-to-earth, much less elitist than you might find in many other kinds of privately funded schools. These are all issues.
They are. And well, I would just like to comment, and again, getting back to what Cindy has said, and how very, very important her work is, both her dissertation work and the work she's doing in her school. Not to get political here, but obviously we're in a time where we're both putting so much energy into maintaining those senses of us versus them and holding on to our own tight little beliefs of things so that we end up blaming the other rather than looking at ourselves. And then the more encouraging part of it for me is the whole idea of social justice, the whole idea of, you know, look what happened as a result of Charlottesville. You know, when we're talking about the PBS folks coming to your school, Cindy, as a result of what happened in Charlottesville. And, you know, it's so sad and unfortunate that it takes an incident like that, or any number of incidences like that, to begin to crack that adherence to our own beliefs. And I don't know what I'm trying to say, just that, you know, I think that the more we focus on us versus them, the worse off we are. And the more that we can start looking at what are the myths, what are the misunderstandings, how can I open myself to understanding, to listening, the better off we're all going to be. Cindy, do you have a...
I'm going to go back and challenge that again. Montessori school is a school of choice, right? I think we all agree on that, whether it's publicly funded or not.
Yes.
And if you're a school of choice, one of the natural things you tend to do is to differentiate yourself from the competition. And I asked a question earlier, why do we need to communicate with those people? And I didn't ask it because I don't think we should or that we can't, but rather I think that most of the people who are our friends and colleagues are struggling with these very issues. They're having a hard enough time convincing parents to come to them and choose their schools. And one of the ways we tend to do it is we differentiate, and I would argue the ones that are really successful can't do it just by negative advertising about how bad it is out there. You have to do it the opposite. You have to form family, community, and a very proactive and positive message like what you folks are talking about, the bond among the diverse families of a school and the children. But I think that my point is there really is a differentiation, if only because our parents are paying or they're choosing our publicly funded school over more convenient ones in many cases to go to this weird non-traditional school. And it's just part of the bigger conversation of why are there misunderstandings, and what do you do if you could create greater understanding? What's in it for you? What's in it for them?
You know, Tim, what you're talking about in creating that sort of identity for the school that makes people want to go there, having spent most of my career in higher education, there's a concept that's talked about in universities a lot, and that's called distinguishability. That is what it is that distinguishes your institution from another one. I mean, why should somebody come to your college instead of somewhere else? What makes it, other than cost or locale, is there something good about your college? And that thing has to be emphasized, and that distinguishes it. That quality is called distinguishability. The reality is our schools do that too, and they need to, because that's how they help clients to make a decision. Now, you're right, that distinguishability should be about us positively, not negatively about somebody else. And sometimes it does slip into that, unfortunately. But I do think we're going to see that schools inevitably, like other kinds of businesses, want to distinguish their product in a particular way. And it ought not to prejudice against the other, but it just does happen. So I think that's what you're talking about, is distinguishability.
Absolutely. And those of you who have ever heard me talk about my vision of Montessori leadership, which is certainly not unique to me, but what the Montessori Foundation teaches is negative advertising hurts both sides. And what we're trying to do is not convert anybody, not the local superintendent, not the local principal, not the public school teacher, not the parent. We're not trying to change them. We're simply offering something that we love, that we feel is distinct, and that we think we do it in some way differently from what's available locally, and we're happy to see more of it around. But we have, this is our home, this is our family. We'll look for people who are going to love us for who we are. And that's the distinguishability you're talking about. It's all about family and community. And I brought that up in part because of misunderstandings. It's kind of like, as I often say, porcupines, you know, begetting new generations of porcupines. They have to be very careful as they go about it so they don't hurt each other. But at the same time, what we're doing is we're forming bonds with parents and kids that really is much more important than what we teach them. It's the way we teach them, or the life they learn to live, which really goes back to your issue of social justice and inclusion, and that every voice is heard and every parent and their tradition is honored. I think that's such a wonderful part of Montessori.
I'd also like to bring up a point that Cindy mentioned earlier about how important it is that we structure our language around inclusivity. And historically, elite professions, the way they're elite is they have a different language. I was just in a lawyer's office with my husband, and I was the translator so that my husband could understand what the lawyer was saying to him. Because lawyers have a different language. That's what separates them. Although
there is a recovering lawyer.
And there is a organization, you know, out there called Lawyers for Plain English. But I think it behooves Montessori professionals who espouse peace, who practice putting the spiritual preparation before anything, that we also start really identifying the commonalities in our language. I think that in the workshop I did with Cindy, that was so abundantly clear that people around the table, because let's face it, everyone has a mental model of what school was like, because everyone's gone to school somewhere at some time. And I can't look at you and know that you graduated from a high school class of 12 or graduated from a high school class of 2000. I don't know what your mental model is, but we all have one. But it was abundantly clear on so many levels that people were actually saying the same thing and not understanding each other. And to me, I see it in our way we write our articles and the way we publish our successes and our challenges. And going back to Michael's previous presentations on curriculum, I was so excited to see his use of language that was so common and so helpful for people who he was addressing educators. And educators, we can use Glasser system or Ted Sizer. It doesn't really matter how we get there, as long as we get there with the umbrella of dignity for all, respect for all, and intentionality that has a level that's cloaked in caring. Because I think the things that we see in the news, like hazing and young adults doing really bad risk behavior activities and struggling with their own individuality, is part of our responsibility, because that's what the social piece is in social justice.
You know, going back to that that bit on curriculum, thanks for referencing that, and thank you for your kind words. Going back to that for just a sec, one of the things I talked about was that there are different kinds of curricula. The one that we write, the one that we actually do, the one that children learn, but I also talked about something, Cindy, called a hidden curriculum. And I think that's what we're talking about to a great extent. A hidden curriculum is something that's made up of our presumptions, our underlying assumptions, our personal experiences, our points of view that we take for granted. And sometimes it becomes part of the curriculum without intentionality. It emerges somehow. And that can have, I suppose, positive aspects at times, but certainly negative aspects can come out of that.
Yes, I would say that it's not only that it emerges sometimes, but it's always present.
Okay.
And that's the piece that we often don't realize. We carry all of the time our ideologies, our perceptions, our mental models, our schemas. It's always there. We have to self-check constantly, because we always have a hidden curriculum in everything that we do, in all of our interactions with people. And that's the difference between, I think that's the eye-opening piece that has happened in the world, that we suddenly discovered that everybody already has one, and everybody was saying, where did this come from? It's always been there. It's that we have to learn how to do something about it and how to reshape those models, which is why we have to do that with ourselves. We have to do that with our partners that we may not have considered partners and affiliates in education, but they are, because we all need to ally with each other, and with the children.
Absolutely. I have two things in mind when you say that. I just this past weekend did a presentation workshop for Montessori teachers on how to create an inclusive classroom, specifically addressing children who have special needs. And that that wall that goes up for a lot of teachers when they hear those two words put together, special needs, click, I don't know how to work with those children. Or that child is a label rather than a child. And getting past that and helping people understand that bottom line, children are children. And some children have different challenges than other children. And yes, there's knowledge that we can gain. There's tools and techniques that we can gain. There are ways that we can observe that will help us be responsive to all of the children in our classroom. Is one, it's another area where we as Montessorians, I think, really need to be open and to look at ourselves and to look at our teaching and be willing to explore, at least, to be willing to investigate. The other thing that I think about is the advocacy work that I do, and at a very concrete level, the importance of looking at commonalities, the importance of looking at common language, is that in many, many, many states, independent schools as well as public schools have rules and regulations that they are legally mandated to comply with, and there are hefty consequences for not complying with those that make it difficult to get back to what you were talking about, authenticity in Montessori. And we can't just go into a regulator and say, for instance, oh, well, we have to have glass in our classroom because that's how we do it. I'm working with a state right now that has some openness to looking at ways of including all kinds of what they're calling alternative pedagogies. And like, okay, that language is all right, I can live with that. But to allow for full implementation of each of those pedagogies. So doing something like making a list of all of the lessons, all of the presentations, all of the activities in the Montessori early childhood classroom that require the use of what might be considered hazardous materials, and helping them understand and use part of the pedagogic skills.
I can't quite hear you.
Somebody's got background noise coming from someone. I'm not sure. But also explaining what are the values and the benefits, and that when a Montessori system with a trained teacher who has rigorous training, and we've got to explain what that means, we have an evidence-based curriculum, that we've got materials that have been used for years and years and years and years. It's about educating. It's about educating people so that we can help them understand why we do things the way we do. So if you want to look at it just from a very kind of self-centered distinguishability, if you will, to use that word, we have to be able to communicate with policymakers in order to be able to do fully what we want to do. And we can't do that by going in and talking Montessoriese or just saying, well, somehow implying that, well, we're Montessorians. And that's where people like the woman at the airport, Michael, get that idea, I think. So, to me, in a very concrete way, that's so much of the value of your work.
And I think that what we may not quite realize is that policymakers are looking at us. They want to see what we're made of. They want to see what kind of partners we can be. They want to see how structured and stuck we are in our unwillingness to be able to work with others or to understand them or to seek to understand them, and whether or not we're saying the same thing or we're confused people who have within our own field of Montessori education, our own cookie cutter ideology about what that should look like and our own unwillingness not to open that up. And they don't have time for that. And so when we finally do get to the table with an issue that is of importance to us, they don't want to bother hearing it until we go away and do our homework and walk our talk and look within and fix our own disconnect and then come back.
You're absolutely right. That idea of we have to speak with one voice. as a Montessori community. And I think that that's one of the things that the state Montessori groups, the active ones, are doing so well. This idea of inclusivity of the Montessori community is what's allowing them to do some of the work that they're doing in the policy because they've done that homework. They've gotten on the same page in terms of how we as Montessorians can agree to disagree when we're kind of in family, if you will. But when we are speaking to people outside of the family, we have to present a unified one-voice message. It's crucial. I agree with you. Thank you, Cindy, for raising that.
Sure.
I think we also ought to remember there's a bigger picture of what's going on out there. The world, in the United States at least, has traditionally been thought of as divided between AMS and AMI. And parents and teachers would ask each other, you know, are you AMS or are you AMI? In reality, we are much more diverse than AMS and AMI. We collectively are all in one way or the other connected with AMS or AMI, but we are also all connected through the International Montessori Council. And that's only one thread in the tapestry of Montessori. What I think we have been working for, the reason why my family started the Montessori Foundation and why we've made so many friends over the years with people like you, is we reached out and looked for fellow travelers who could see beyond the idea of parochiality, of one tradition versus another. And in reality, AMS represents a huge range of practice in terms of the Montessori classroom. And so does AMI when you really get close to it. There are many traditions. What's happened over the last 5 years is the leaders of the Montessori community, and I want to admit, that doesn't mean every single organization. It really means the three largest, AMS, AMI, and IMC. And I know for those of you who are listening who are still confused, the Montessori Foundation came first. It grew out of my family's work that started back in 1932. It started in Washington, D.C., where we were surrounded by AMI schools and were a much larger school than any of them. And we reached out to argue with leaders within the AMS that all of us had to think outside of the box, realize we're part of one family, and work together, because we can't, we either hang together or we hang separately, as it was said long ago. We are one. And the Montessori Leaders Collaborative, or MLC, works only because, one, everyone was willing to come to the table initially. There was good facilitation. There was a lot of meals shared, a lot of red wine, and a lot of hours. Many, 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 many days are spent every year in conversation within the leaders of that group. And it's broadened out. We've just taken on a member representing Montessorians for Social Justice, and it continues to expand. Now, that's not a congress of the Montessori community. It's a kernel of change. Christine, you work specifically on behalf of so many of these state agencies. And when I first met you, Cindy, you were working with the California Montessori Alliance to do the same thing in your state, which is bigger than all but 4 other national economies. We are gradually learning how to talk to each other, to live with each other's differences, to recognize that even among Montessorians, there are so many different experiences and narratives and different kinds of schools, not just AMS and AMI, but public and private and charter and big and small and infant, toddler, and early childhood versus schools like ours that go up through high school. You name it. We are a diverse family of educators, and we're a small part of a huge worldwide community of educators who barely know that we exist. And part of what this conversation is about is how can we be nicer to each other, and what's in it for us, And also, how can we reach out to people who really care about children just like we do? And even though they would like to paint us all with one brush and make policy that feels to us sometimes like they want us all to march in lockstep to their narrative and be like them, you know, give the same test, hold kids accountable in the same ways. We have to remember that on the one hand, we're in the business of social change and change of education. That's our mission. And if we lose that, then we may as well give up, because our job is to reshape the way people think about children and about their potentiality and the way they treat families and the idea of partnership within businesses and within school systems. But it may not be in the name of Montessori. That's why Maria didn't copyright it. Her vision was we were going to change the world. Us, not in her name, but in the name of the child.
You know, the one thing that I thought was really interesting that came out of the discussion that had to do with public school Montessorians, that I thought what was a piece that I hoped would be a takeaway for the Montessori leaders were the areas in which they were calling us on the carpet that we really needed to look at. One of the things that had come up, I think, Tanya, it might have been in the workshop where you were, was the accountability issue. And what happens? What happens in Montessori schools when there isn't a sufficient accountability, and maybe we don't have a system that is as rigid as in public school, but do we have one? Is there any way to end up developing accountability for the protection of the children? And it was, for some people, you could tell it just hit them like a brick wall. But I think for the individuals who were both Montessorians and public school teachers or leaders, I think that they were the ones who were able to see it from two different views and to say, you know, there's a piece about that we really need to look at, and we really need to find a way that we can end up showing that we have some accountability or create the accountability so that it's there. And so I think that there are some things like that where we can't simply say, well, yeah, we want to be a player, that we also have to say we have to grow too.
Exactly. You know, and I think that words like accountability, data, assessment, those are buzzwords that immediately kick into people's prejudice and biases. And I absolutely could not agree with you more. As a Montessori community, we have to, without compromising what we're doing, we can still maintain integrity, but we need to demonstrate that we do have some accountability. We are collecting data. I'm deliberately using these words. That we do have a way of assessing what we do and what our students are gaining from it. That doesn't mean that we have to do it in a way that is being done elsewhere. But the concept of demonstrating that we are educating children on a number of parameters is just as important as it is to anybody who's educating children, regardless of what model they're using to do that. I don't think we should be afraid of those words, afraid of that concept. As an abstract concept, we've got nothing to do with it.
No, we ask for it of the children in the third period.
In most states, the way that looks these days is a state-specific exam, like the Florida, what they call it, the FCAT, the Florida, I don't remember what it stands for, competencies of comprehensive academic testing is what it used to be called. And I know every state typically has it. In part, they do it to measure themselves only against themselves instead of being compared against the whole nation. It's hard to have your state compared to a place like New York or Massachusetts, which tends to, shall we say, have very high achievement. And California is a very diverse state where you've got incredible range of achievement and diversity. But what does it look like when Montessorians begin to become accountable if they're not publicly funded? If you're publicly funded, you're going to do whatever your state demands. But let's say you run, Cindy, a Child Unique. I run the Newgate School. Tanya, for years you worked with the Brookview School. Christine, for years you had Montessori schools that were independent. What does it look like? What's best practice other than giving the same test that the public schools do, or is it what we do?
I think that's what I'm trying to say, Tim, is how do we look at what accountability looks like within Montessori? And it doesn't mean defaulting to the test that is being state mandated necessarily. Now, obviously some of the Montessori publics do have some requirement to do that. But I know in North Carolina, for instance, where I am living, the Montessori public schools have been able to work with the powers that be to look at what would be some ways of providing the same kind of information, or maybe looking at the intra-growth and the progress of a student, and what would be an instrument that could be used to demonstrate that, and saying to the more mainstream education policymakers, this is the way that we are going to be accountable. So it's not that we're compromising Montessori in any way, but we are demonstrating this level of accountability. It's the same thing with our teacher credential.
Let's get more specific if we can, because we've got listeners from different countries, but certainly many are in the United States.
Right.
What are some of the specific strategies that we've identified that can be used that actually achieve these goals? It may not be a one-size-fits-all. I'll start. I'm a great believer in, of course, holistic assessment, which involves many different means, but one of the assessment strategies is something other than portfolios and narrations of observations. And we use a formative assessment strategy. So there are several of those tests out there. The ones that I know personally are the MAP, Measures of Academic Progress, from Northwest Educational Associates. And I happen to have a small consortium of Montessori schools that uses a competitor that's very similar called Scantron, the Scantron Performance Series, which does essentially the same thing. Do formative tests, or do we need to have a summative test? And do we know the difference between the two out there? We haven't heard much, by the way, from the audience. And I'm gonna stop us where we respond to the question I just asked, and I'm gonna ask us all to breathe in, take a moment. We still have about 17 minutes left in the official session. I want to acknowledge that as we've been speaking, I just got word that Puerto Rico is now without power. The entire island is without power.
Wow.
This hurricane has devastated the islands that it's hit. I'm very dear friends with many of the schools in the Caribbean. I was talking just yesterday with the head of the Virgin Islands Montessori School. They're being wiped out for at least a year as a result of this. I try to imagine what this could mean, and the reports are just coming in now from places that were hit in Louisiana and in the Houston, Texas area, and I'm sure we're just beginning to get a sense of how many schools were seriously damaged. And I'm still waiting to hear for news from the schools in Miami, which ones are okay and which ones are not. But try to imagine what's happened to the Montessori community in the Virgin Islands and the Leeward Islands and Puerto Rico. Anyway, let's take a breath, appreciate the children we know and the schools that we love. Think about the people in Mexico who just experienced that horrible earthquake yesterday. And remember, we're all in it together. This is not a movie. So, how do we assess children? How do we become accountable?
Christine?
I'll just have to say my area of expertise is not student assessment, but in terms of advocacy work, explaining to non-Montessorians that we engage in formative assessment constantly in an ongoing way, that we have very clear documentation that we use to measure, if you will, what each student is doing, how each student is progressing, what lessons have been given to each student, what kind of social emotional development do we see. And simply explaining that and showing some of the record keeping that we do, and that
let's unpack that, Christine, because I'm intuiting that our listeners may really need to think this through. These are not easy concepts unless you already know them. So you've just talked about formative assessment. I mentioned formative and summative. Let's start with what are they?
Okay, so summative assessment, as I understand it, and Tim, I want you to help here. A summative assessment is a standardized measurement, often looking at a student's chronological age, that is testing them on a particular body of knowledge to compare them to their chronological age peers within a school, within a district, within a state, across state lines. Formative assessment is an ongoing, the teacher is gathering information to impact her teaching, his teaching of particular children. So what we do in Montessori, anybody who's a Montessorian who's on this call knows this well, observation is the foundation of what we do in the classroom, right? It's how we know what lesson to give, how to give it, what step comes next, how to scaffold that work so that we're meeting the child where they are going to be most successful. If we translate that and call it formative assessment, mainstream educators understand what we're doing. And then if we show them, this is how we do observation, this is the documentation that we collect, that's the kind of language that we can use with non-Montessorians so that they go, oh, we didn't know that you did that. And we're explaining to them that we do it and how we do it. And I think I think, Cindy, that's part of what you were getting at with the work that you did with these groups, is coming up with sharing information and sharing it in a way that everyone can understand. Does that make more sense?
Right. Hang on a second, Christine. I want to do a reality check among our panelists. I'm getting various people telling me that the sound is getting wonky, at least for you, Christine. Can folks, if you're still online, would you just quickly type in whether you can still see and hear okay? And if you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear from you in our last few minutes.
Cindy,
we're doing that. I'm just gonna. Can you all hear me? Okay. I'm just gonna try to quickly summarize what Christine just said, in case someone didn't hear it, because I'm seeing people saying they're not hearing it clearly. Summative assessment is standardized. And formative assessment can be standardized. It can also not be standardized. But for the moment, let's talk about standardized testing. A summative test gives children of a certain grade the same test, the same questions, the same amount of time. And the goal is to see how well do children within the tested group do compared to other children in the exact same situation. A formative test looks at a child, let's say Cindy, and says, let's start testing Cindy and see what she knows and doesn't know. And we'll figure out what the ceiling, the floor is. At what point are we confident she really knows her stuff well? And we'll keep raising it up, 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 up to see where her ceiling is, what she does not yet know. And we can do that more often than once a year, so we get a sense of how Cindy as a learner changes from one testing to the other. The other characteristic of these tests is they're not timed, They can be paused. The child can feel sick and say, I'd like to stop. I want to come back to this. And they're more flexible. There are advantages and disadvantages, but I think that they certainly feel to me more Montessori than the typical standardized test. And that's the difference between the two. Whether or not formative tests are really taken seriously by the profession is an interesting question. You don't see any public school districts using them in lieu of standardized summative tests, the end of year tests, the state tests. Michael, I know this is an area where you have a lot of background.
Well, I want to put it in really simple terms because I think that maybe this is not as complex as it seems at first. Fundamentally, my understanding of a formative assessment is an assessment of progress. So what we're doing to assess progress, that's formative. And it helps us in diagnosing future work. And summative assessment is an assessment of outcomes. So it's looking at conclusion outcomes. Now, tests are one of those kinds of assessments. But I think whether it's a test or some other method of assessment, the difference between the two is what we're looking at. So when we're looking at a formative assessment, we're saying, how is this kid progressing, and what should we do from now on to help the progress? When we're looking summatively, we're looking at, did they achieve their outcomes?
Thank you, Michael. Very clearly said. Hi, Tanya.
I would like to ask Cindy, though, in the accountability piece that she was looking at, because I have not been able to read her dissertation yet, but was it more than just children's activities? Were you looking at accountability for faculty credentialing? Were you looking at accountability for procedures and protocols and processes that create safe learning environments? Because we've been holding schools accountable for years, and yet we're graduating children from high school who can't read. So, I mean, you know, the accountability argument, I believe you said, went both ways, that both populations, or all three populations, had issues with accountability. If that's the case, then to Christine's point, starting with a common language of who are we holding accountable for what has to take place first, and it has to be all of us in education. And I'm going to say that part of the accountability piece in K-12 education, leadership education, has really fallen flat, is holding universities accountable.
Well, yeah, the paper doesn't tease out with great extent all of the areas of accountability, but what came up was accountability for teachers and learning, so teaching and learning, and definitely accountability for teacher coursework in teacher credentialing systems. So both of those, all the way from teaching the teacher and then teaching the children, that is where they felt that there were problems with accountability, and I would say that it was the greater language that came from the public sector regarding Montessori education. More fervor from the Montessori education for public.
Which would make sense.
So,
It's not standard. It's not, you don't graduate with a degree in a university, or it's harder to. So that makes sense. But was it really focused on children and testing as well?
It was focused on children and learning, and the extent that they need to know, and that public school teachers felt that was lacking in a Montessori environment.
Well, this is a fascinating conversation, and we're beginning to run out of time. I want to invite anyone who has last questions to write them in so we can address them before you leave. And I want to just express my deep appreciation to all of you who were able to attend today, Christine and Michael and you, Cindy, and You know, we've
And Tanya.
Karen behind you in tech. This is a very complicated issue, and it may be that you all will be interested in another webinar that explores different aspects of this. So
I do think that
I want to
would be a
remind everyone
wonderful
we have a handout. I provided a handout for everyone of Cindy's dissertation, and if you haven't already seen it, before we log off, I invite you to click on the handouts area and download it. Cindy, I think that was you. You want to say something?
I was just going to say that I do think, to wrap up the accountability piece, it would be a wonderful thing to be able to do in person somewhere where Montessorians come together and share what they're doing around accountability for their schools with people who have knowledge of the systems within the public sector, so that we could look at whether or not we can get somewhere with that without fear of that word.
Excellent. Well, I'm sorry. Some people are saying that the sound has gotten wonky, and I just want to remind you that there's a lot of things happening out there in the world right at the moment, including solar flares that we're affecting. We've got a hurricane affecting a big chunk of the internet that feeds the southern hemisphere. We've got disruptions down in Mexico, and I see several of you who I know are in Mexico. My heart goes out to you all who were affected. This has just been wonderful. Cindy, thank you for making the time. I want to restate for those of you who weren't on right at the beginning, tomorrow, PBS, the Public Broadcasting System, is coming to Cindy Acker's school at Child Unique, which is located just outside of San Francisco, California. Remind me of the name of the city where you're located?
Alameda.
That's right, Alameda. And they're going to be looking at your school as part of a documentary or a piece on teaching diversity and multiculturalism and social justice within schools beginning at age 3. And I believe it's going to air sometime in October, did I hear?
October, November. It's an answer back to what happened in Charlottesville.
Excellent. Well, Cindy, I always enjoy having you on. I hope you can make more time to join us. Christine, the same. Tanya, love seeing you guys. And just, we have next week's booked, but we don't have anything specifically planned beyond that. So if any of you have any topics you want to explore, give me a call, send me a text, send me an email, and that includes those of you in the audience if there's something you wish that we would cover next. This is a series of free webinars brought to you, webcasts, as my wife Joyce reminds me. We distinguish between the parenting webinars. These are webcasts. We do them for free. You can get continuing education units for them from the American Montessori Society. The IMC recognizes them, and you can get continuing education units if you want to go through the formality of the whole process through Landers University, but you need 10 hours or more of these things for one continuing education unit. Next week, our guest is going to be someone we've not had before. Her name is Bryn Rangel, and she is going to talk to us about how Montessorians can learn from psychologists about how to deal with really challenging behavior in the Montessori classroom. This one will definitely challenge each of you. She has things to share that are beyond what we learned in training for positive discipline or whatever that I think you'll find really interesting. Bryn is a Montessori mom. She looks at Montessori education, and in her opinion, there are things we need to know that will help us to do our job better. I look forward to hearing what she's got to tell us next week. So, without any further ado, let me let you all go back to your busy days. To all of you out there, wherever you are in the world, this is Tim Selden from the Montessori Foundation saying, Cindy, Tanya, Michael, Christine, love you guys. You're wonderful. Thanks for making the time.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Good night and good luck.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.